Thank you, Ross. My understanding, Ross has been up here filibustering for a little bit of time. My apologies for being late. I was out at a unnamed intelligence facility in Northern Virginia, and I got to tell you, as a former governor, somebody needs something to do something about that damn traffic. It was pretty bad. So I am grateful to be here. I see some friendly faces in the crowd, and anxious to have a chance to share with you some of the ideas. I don't know whether Ross, in his riffing, gave you, for those of you who don't know me, any of my background. I still can claim I have spent longer in business than I have in politics. I was a venture capitalist. I was a co-founder of Nextel. Very proud of my firm, Columbia Capital, which is still a major leader in the Mid-Atlantic, mostly in telecom and IT. As well, some of the subjects we're going to be talking about this morning, and I know you've been focused on already in my kind of complete immersion into politics. Went out and formed a series of regional venture capital funds around Virginia, because I think one of the challenges we have in the technology world, and going back now almost to the 1990s for those of us who are a few that are old enough to remember, when there was that whole question, who's more important, Bill Clinton or Bill Gates? That was a great kind of mid to late 90s debate, because while both offered a vision of where our country and where the world was headed, part of the challenge and part of the opportunity in an interconnected world was that you can build it anywhere, that you don't need to be in a few select locations. And we've shown in a world economy that you can build it in Shanghai and Mumbai. We've not done as well of showing you can build it in Danville, Virginia, or Akron, Ohio, or pick any community around the country that is not one of the three states where unfortunately still close to 80-85% of all the venture capital still goes to California, New York, and Massachusetts. Something that if we're going to really realize the opportunity that it can be built anywhere in America, what Village Capital is doing, what EIG is doing, what the Rise of the Rest is doing, is really more important than ever. I also want to acknowledge, I know EIG's been involved in this effort, Open Market's been involved. I'm not sure if we've got some other folks here from the Kauffman Foundation, but Kauffman has been, want to commend you guys over the years for the great work you've done on the really good data about entrepreneurship and how important it is, and something that really affects policymakers. In the Senate, I've tried to be, whether it was partnering with my friend Jerry Moran, in startup legislation 1, 2, and 3, and trying to continue to work on entrepreneurship visas, trying to work on crowdfunding issues, a host of areas about how we spur entrepreneurship around the country. So in the Senate, I think because of my background, I've been referred to oftentimes as the tech guy. Now, in the Senate, that's a fairly low bar, so I'm not sure that makes me current with everybody in the room. I used to like to say that I was very current on tech policy, tech development, up to about the year 2001 when I got elected as governor. But being tech savvy with a 2001 due date still puts me a decade ahead of most of my Senate colleagues. So I'll take some pleasure in that. I want to go through 4 or 5 items here. I had a much more structured speech, but since I'm late, I want to try to just get right into it. I want to talk a little bit about social media and some of the challenges we've seen in that space. I think for a long time, rightfully so, perhaps, we have been enamored with social media. I think if we think about some of the great 21st century American success stories, if we go down Google and Facebook and Twitter and a series of smaller entities, they are wonderfully successful. They have changed the way we communicate. They've changed the way we think about community. And for a long time, and for frankly most of the 21st century, politicians of every stripe have celebrated these companies and their wonderful success. The challenge is, as we think about these digital technology companies and all of the ramifications, they are clearly transforming our society, but I also think, particularly in the last couple of years, not necessarily starting with the Russian intervention in the 2016 campaigns, but that was kind of put an accelerator to it. We've also started to see that there is a dark underbelly in these new communities that have been created. And one of my concerns have been that, well, many of the founders of these enterprises, I think, started with extremely, broad-minded global implications of all the good they're going to do. The truth is, as we started to see some of the underbelly and some of the dark underside, I think for the most part, many of these companies' leadership were extraordinarily slow in recognizing that there are hugely potentially negative implications of some of that transformation. And the truth is we're just coming to start to understand that. And in many ways, the honeymoon that was started in both the Bush administration and continued in the Obama administration kind of came to a screeching halt in 2016, although not necessarily in 2016, because even in the aftermath of 2016, I can recall, pointing out some of these problems and potential misuse as early as November and December of 2016, and certain extraordinarily prominent CEOs who I won't call out directly right now, I still remember famously made comments like, "Oh my gosh, if any politicians think that Facebook could be misused, they just don't get it." Well, shows that even some of the brightest, most forward-leaning of our tech entrepreneurs may not get exactly in certain ways, the entities they've created, and yes, they can be used enormously for forces of good, but they can also be used to exacerbate divisions in ways I don't think any of us ever predicted. Obviously, this has been a topic that I've taken on as the Vice Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee with our investigation into Russian interference meddling. We are a year and a half into that process. We've got, literally multiple dozens of witnesses that still need to be talked to, and in many ways we're still sorting through what happened. What we do know is that Russia and its agents used the social media platforms in ways that nobody ever envisioned. We know that they used them to, well, we initially thought that this was going to be driven by paid advertising in terms of the misuse and disinformation campaign was really only the very tiniest tip of the iceberg. What much more has been the tools was the use of bots, was the use of automated accounts, was the ability to create hugely fake personas that would gather in followers, whether it might be, followers of Alabama football or followers of different types of cooking or followers of vegetarian lifestyles, and would lure in not always suspecting Americans. And then as they gained literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of followers on individual sites, these tools were used and turned into manipulative political activities. And the truth is, this was an amazingly cheap and amazingly effective tool. Trolls, fake accounts, bots, misuse of information, the real fake news that in many ways has thrown our political system into a cycle of back and forth that we still haven't really sorted out. And this is not over. One of the things that the German Marshall Fund has shown, they've been doing a fairly good job of monitoring this activity, and I'm trying to get a full intelligence community report in the next few days, I think that we will discover that a large amount of the most vile vitriol on either end of the political spectrum that took place last week during the Kavanaugh hearings, and clearly Americans felt very strongly on both sides of that issue, but the real, kind of heinous, over-the-top vitriol was not generated by actual American discontent, but was generated by foreign bot activity. Matter of fact, John Kelly, one of the experts in this field that we've had testify, meet in private with us and in public, at a public setting in early August, indicated, and this gave me a little bit of sense of actually made me feel a little bit better. He cites, and I want to try to drive this and see if we can get it validated, but he says that the political content on the web, on the far left and far right, is actually 25 to 30 to 1, either foreign-based or bot activity versus actually American citizens. And that's a stunning statistic. Even if that is, if we cut that figure in half, it is a stunning statistic. And in a certain sense, should make us feel a little bit better, it would say there's maybe not as many wackos within the American political system as otherwise seems to be, reflected. What we've also seen, and one of the things that Russia did, this was not just an American phenomenon. I recently had collected a series of parliamentarians because every one of the 29 NATO nations has seen Russian activity in terms of misuse of social media within their respective countries. And one of the more surreal moments I've had in the last year and a half was we got together parliamentarians from about 15 different nations, including Canada, including the UK, including Italy. The French were supposed to come, but it was the night after the World Cup, so the parliamentarian didn't make the plane. But every one of those nations had indicated that there had been Russian activity. We happened to meet, ironically enough, and this was through the Atlantic Foundation, and Marco Rubio was part of the meeting as well, on the day where Mr. Trump was meeting with Mr. Putin. So it was interesting having all our European colleagues in talking about Russian interference when we were having an American president kowtow to a Russian president and accept his explanation of, hey, nothing going on here, which was a great irony. But one of the things that we have been able to do a bit of an assessment, and that was to add up the amount of resources that were spent by the Russians interfering in our elections, interfering in the French elections, where actually Facebook was a lot more proactive on taking down fake accounts, and on the Brexit vote, where the British were late to the game but now have their own parliamentary commission set up looking into those activities. And you add up the Russian activity in America, France, and Britain and combine it together, and you have total amount of cost is less than the cost of one new F-35 airplane. So I know I'm going to move more into the technology space in a moment, but if we think about this, even from just a national security standpoint, the United States of America just appropriated $713 billion in our defense budget, largest defense budget ever. Russia has a defense budget of about $70 billion. I sometimes worry that we may be buying the world's best 20th century military, but increasingly in a world where most of the conflict, I believe, in the 21st century will take place within the domain of cyber and misinformation and disinformation. And our near-peer adversaries like Russia and China, for a lot less investment, are already our peers. And I would argue in the realm of misinformation, disinformation, Russia in particular frankly does a better job than we do. But this has not just been the misuse of technology and in the fields of electioneering. We've seen, and candidly, I think we need a lot more public exposure of this kind of activity. We've seen misuse of the internet, misuse of social media in terms of financial fraud in the area of stock pumping. We've seen enormous amount of abuse in click fraud in digital advertising. We've seen the use of social media to promote counterfeit drugs in ways that have enormous health care consequences. And we've seen the ability of social media to be misused in terms of spreading of malicious apps. And matter of fact, as recently as the last 6 or 9 months, we've even seen in the case of Myanmar, in effect, state-sponsored accounts urging genocide against fellow citizens simply because they happen to be Rohingya. I would give Sheryl Sandberg credit for the fact that during recent testimony she acknowledged that not only did Facebook have a moral responsibility to take those accounts down, but a legal responsibility as well. We hope to hold Facebook to those kind of standards as we go forward. And I think both by necessity and driven by the enormous amount of attention, we're seeing these organizations start to make some progress. But that progress has been incremental, and quite honestly, as somebody who's been very involved in some of the policy ideas here, getting them to say, yes, we want to work with you, to actually saying, here's area where we can agree upon policy changes. The talk has been a lot more, the talk has been better than the actions to date, and that means that we've still got a long ways to go. And matter of fact, we've seen some enterprises, and I say this as somebody who has been a long-term supporter of Google, but I have been extraordinarily disappointed with Google. Their failure to send a senior executive to testify before our committee, their willingness to come in and only talk to people from one party. And the truth is, as increasingly we see, while the volume of posts and tweets may have been Facebook and Twitter, the real ability to manipulate and spread particularly extreme ideology on either the left or right is much more prevalent on YouTube than it is on short tweets. And Google at its own, I think, ultimate harm needs to come to the table, and maybe they don't want to talk about building a sensor-driven search engine for China only, but this kind of activity is not going to be allowed on a long-term basis in terms of policy going forward. And we've also seen that more recently, and don't want to, again, just focus on Google, but to me, one of the many areas where we need some new policy is when we've seen Google recently take with a massive breach of users' privacy, 500,000. Don't give me the high wave. I'm going to finish my talk. When we've seen Google discover this abuse of their system and then hold it confidential for literally months on end. And to my mind, as we think about where there needs to be policy requirements, and I'm not just talking about a Google, I'm talking about an Equifax as well, we need new Securities and Exchange regulations around materiality. If there are cyber breaches, if there are kind of abuses of the system, and particularly if you are a public company, we need to find a way to recognize that those are material facts that need to go forward. And let me just assure you, some of you have heard this line from me before, as the co-founder of Nextel, I don't mind if you leave your cell phones on even when I'm speaking. You might be embarrassed. I hear cha-ching, cha-ching when it goes off. So, so where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? We need increased transparency. Ross, if nothing else, I am predictable on certain things. We need increased transparency. We need increased competition, and competition is, I know, one of the subjects of this matter. And I come to this again as somebody who is a VC who believes strongly in increased competition, increased competitive landscape for our market. The truth is, though, we don't have that. Again, let me stay with social media for a moment. If you look at an app store, 8 of the top 10 apps, and all of the top 5 apps are all owned by two companies, Google and Facebook. And the truth is, even if you have that killer new app that's coming out, your exit as a former VC really is not to take that idea to market and fully get it to a fully competitive standpoint where you can go public as well. Your exit is either to sell to one of these large enterprises, or if you don't sell, to have your intellectual property stolen and a clone competitor created by one of these large platforms. And in a world where data is the new oil, where we're going to move into machine learning and artificial intelligence, this problem is only going to get exponentially worse. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in the number of deals that go to market, particularly in the app space. We've seen that in the fact that seed deals and angel level deals have dropped about 40% since 2015. And the truth is, this is not a problem. This is a problem that's only going to get worse unless we can think some parameters about this. Now, part of the role of government has obviously been to encourage and incent startups. And I want to, particularly recognize EIG. One of the only good things I think that took place in the so-called tax reform, which was basically a $2 trillion tax cut with borrowed money at the end of an economic cycle. Not necessarily the right time to do that, but the notion of the creation of these new enterprise zones where startups will get much more favorable tax treatment is, I think, a great step in the right direction. But as government's role is to encourage startups, government's role is also, and has traditionally been and historically been, is to continue to foster competition. And I think we really need, and I know this is the subject of this conference, to really think how we go about fostering that kind of competition. I'm old enough to remember that the only reason I'm standing up here making my cell phone jokes was back in the 1980s and 1990s, wireless technology, if there hadn't been an active government role, would have been completely dominated in this country by simply AT&T, or even after the breakup of AT&T by 6 or 7 lumbering RBUCs, they were called at that point. It was only because there was proactive government policy around the competition space in terms of breaking up of AT&T, and then active intervention at the FCC to make sure that the spectrum allocation that came about with wireless was divided in a competitive basis where the incumbents had one set of frequencies and the new insurgents had the other set of frequencies that allowed the kind of dynamic wireless competition that we have in this country right now. And the truth is now, as we go into this next realm, if spectrum was the gold in the 80s and 90s, and although spectrum as we go into 5G is continuing to be gold, and one of the things, this is not the subject of today's conversation, but would love to visit with folks on this subject, if you've got some views, in past kind of wireless iterations, it was usually one Western company or one Western technology against another. And so who won was of importance to the government, but not critical. But right now, in a world where there are no Western equipment providers at the top end, it is a fragmented West against a very organized China with Huawei's ZTEs and China Telecom as the largest kind of systems provider. And this has both national security as well as obviously competition requirements. So what do? The truth is, as we've said, data is the new oil, and we have the notion that says, how are you going to really have a competitive market landscape if you start with virtually no data and the incumbents have masses beyond belief? I would argue that this kind of business proposition is virtually different than anything we've seen in the past. No matter how good your product was in terms of software with Microsoft or hardware with Apple, those are different business models where a better, newer mousetrap can still compete. In the world, whether it's social media, whether it's as we move into machine learning and AI, the aggregate amount of data that you already have may make it virtually impossible for any new competitor to actually ever get to scale. And that kind of business model, to have the ability to think about how we can dislodge incumbents on a competitive landscape, is an area where I don't think there's been anything like this in the past. So how do we think this through? And let me be clear, one of the reasons I've got some folks on my staff who want me to come out even more stridently on some of these issues, but I am concerned that if we were to simply, though, dismember some of the largest American tech enterprises, I don't want them to be replaced, at least within our system. You don't have Google or Facebook actively sharing all that data with the US government. I am concerned in a world where all of this is now global, where you've got a Chinese government that in its own, in terms of facial recognition and other areas, collects huge, massive amounts of technology, and quite honestly, where companies like Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, at the end of the day, are not responsible to their shareholders or their board, but ultimately can always have intervention at the governmental level, and that intervention will mean sharing that data that they've collected at mass numbers with a government that already has a larger amount of N-based data than any enterprise in the world. So I've tried to think about this from a policy standpoint, and recently put out a white paper that had 20 ideas, not all good, not all bad. I thought it was interesting, some of the reaction to that paper. Some folks said, attaboy, Warner, you're thinking up some interesting ideas and maybe a way to elevate the debate a little bit. I also got accused in certain periodicals as out to destroy the internet. Let me unequivocally say that was not my goal going forward. But what I think we need to point out, and let me give you a couple examples, and I will try to wrap this up fairly quickly, is there is a kind of rule of thumb from business that sometimes I think almost too reflexively that all government regulation per se is bad, and that regulation in and of itself always creates a cost. And to some level that is true. Let me acknowledge that. And there are ways to do smart regulation and there's ways to do dumb regulation. But I would also make the argument, and one of the things I'd hope as a takeaway here, is that government inaction, particularly from an American standpoint, can also be a cost to a competitive market landscape. And I don't think that point has been fully understood by many of the men and women that I work with. So let me give you two examples. We've seen the EU move forward on privacy with GDPR. Now, I think there's some good things there. I think there's some things that may be a little too, what's the word I'm looking for? A little too broad-based and not surgical enough. But the fact that we in America did not take the lead on privacy means that the Europeans, in terms of GDPR, is now being used as the model for privacy protections in countries like Brazil, India, Kenya, and in a realm where there's always been American leadership, American failure to provide leadership in this space has allowed the kind of locus and focus of not only the regulation, but all of the enterprises that will be created around that regulation to be moved offshore. Another one that is kind of like the lowest hanging fruit around, and one that makes me crazy, is we all know that we're going to move into a world where every device is connected to the internet. I heard a number recently that surprised the heck out of me, because I didn't think we'd hit this number as quickly, but this was a US government number saying that we're going to be approaching within this year 42 billion devices just in the United States connected to the internet. I think it is absolutely insane as we build out all these devices and all of the connectivity that's going to come about from that, that we have no de minimis security requirements. So we put together the lightest touch possible bipartisan legislation that would say on IoT devices, and this would not be a pure government mandate, it would simply use the purchasing power of the government to say, if the US government, if you're using your tax dollars to buy an IoT connected device, it ought to be patchable. It ought to not have an embedded passcode. It ought to make sure that if there are known vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities are shared. Yet the fact that we have not been able to move that, I do think the government will start to act on that administratively, because it's lunacy that we haven't been able to legislate it, and it's frankly driven by the lowest common denominator, cheapest device makers who don't want to have that extra 50 cents of cost. We are going to again lose an area of leadership, and we are seeing now the EU and Japan start to create their IoT security device standards, where once again America will lose its lead. And this same kind of debate is even exponentially larger and more potentially troublesome in the whole 5G world. So we do have to figure out how we think about a regulatory and standard structure that is not static and ham-handed the way the 20th century was, how it can be more 21st century based, how it can be more flexible. There are models out there that ought to be at least examined. I think the securities world is one that's fairly complicated. There are industry-run kind of regulators like a FINRA that sets the first set of regulation, and then if an enterprise screws up, you've got SEC and others behind it. There might be that model that we could look at. But in the paper that I laid out, there were a series of ideas, and I'll run through these, and I know my staff keeps giving me the hook here, that I think we ought to talk about. And not all of these, this is a technology-driven argument or audience. Some of these are more on the simplistic side, but at least they're ones that I think ought to generate debate. One, shouldn't we have a right to know when we are contacted, whether it's in a post or an email or a tweet, whether that entity that is posting or tweeting or communicating with us is an actual human being or a bot? Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a bot. There's nothing inherently wrong with a computer-generated communication. But shouldn't we at least have the right to know as we start to make determinations about authenticity and how much we want to believe in that? Isn't there a public interest, perhaps, in at least having anonymized data and APIs made available to not necessarily government, but to outside researchers to look at things around bias or other areas where there's some kind of good housekeeping seal of approval? Doesn't need to be the government. It could be academics, it could be others, but it's something that we ought to sort through. Shouldn't we have a kind of open discussion, again, back to social media? Why in the heck are social media terms of use so damn hard to understand? And, we all know what we do. We simply click, I agree. Is there a way to think through these in a way that should be plain English? And are there certain things that you should not be able to give away no matter how extensive the description is? Shouldn't we think about, and again, as a former telecom guy, shouldn't we think about data portability? Shouldn't we make it a heck of a lot easier if I want to move all my Facebook account information, including my cat videos, to another enterprise, that it be done in an easy and user-friendly way? Now, again, those of us who are old in the room can remember when it was really hard to switch from one telecom provider to another. That was all made easier because there was government legislation that talked about number portability. Should we have data portability combined with an interoperability standards that would at least, again, think about competitive ways to break this market? There is the top-down regulatory approach, but I'd much rather start with competition models. Should we think about some of the parts of GDPR, like only allowing first-party consent in terms of use of your data? At least have a full-fledged debate. And one of the areas that I would like the most, and we got some indication from at least Facebook and Twitter that they were open to it. Now, again, we'll have to see whether reality hits the road when we think about real policy, is shouldn't we have the right to know in a user-friendly way how much data any of these companies have about us with a level of specificity? And if we had the ability to know with some transparency what data that the platform companies have on each of us, that would be important. But what would really be, I think, the key to unlocking at least increased competition would be, can we not only know what that data is, but can we then know to the enterprise, to the platform company, how much that data is worth? Too many Americans think, oh my gosh, isn't this great? Facebook, Google, Twitter. It's all free stuff. It's not free. We are giving up extraordinary, valuable pieces of information about each of us, and my view at least is, if we had not only that data transparency, but also pricing transparency, there might be a whole new business model where entities could come in and end up being the intermediary between the user and the platform that might provide the kind of choices we'd want on what level of data protection that wouldn't necessarily then have to be mandated by government. Wouldn't it be better to have a competition model rather than a straight regulatory model? There are a host of other notions that I think we need. What I would like from you guys is this issue is only going to get bigger. This question, both about size and power of these enterprises, is only going to grow larger. And I say, for those of you who may be representative of the enterprises, you need to come to the table because something will happen. I would argue within the next 18 to 24 months that will be so draconian that will then cause Congress and the politicians to overreact. I think it will be a combination, and we've kind of thought about from a national security and policy standpoint, we've kind of isolated, or we've separated cybersecurity and misinformation, disinformation, and social media into two buckets. Our adversaries, as far back as 1998 and 99, combined those two enterprises. They are completely seamless. So in a not too distant future, I could very easily envision a Equifax level hack that would provide personalized information on each and every one of us, and that information would then be used to contact you. You would then open that communication, and you would end up with a deep fake video of an individual, whether it's a politician or a business leader or a Fed chair. And the ramifications of that kind of misuse and that kind of misinformation will rock our markets or rock our personal lives or rock our political system in a way that we can't retreat back from. So, I'm not here as a Luddite. I'm not here as somebody that doesn't believe American technology ought to continue to be the world leader, but we need your help, your ideas, and your suggestions. This is an area that is ripe for policy. It is also one of the few areas where I work on a daily basis that none of this breaks down Democrat, Republican. None of this is conservative, liberal. This is a future past. And you all in this room, by the very virtue of you being in this room, need to be part of that future policy decisions we need to make. And I want to again thank Ross and everyone else, because to make that happen, you've got to also have the early stage capital to continue to drive these policy things. I know they're trying to give me the hook, but can I take a question, or should I? Ross, what do you think? Should I take the question? I'll take one question. I got to still be.
As one of your constituents. Okay, so one thing that I just wanted to mention, you're obviously a leader in this respect. You have really strong values, priorities here, in what your daily work is. Something you mentioned at the beginning of your speech, you made a joke, which is a good icebreaker, that you are dated as 2001. I think you're a little bit farther ahead than that. A lot of your colleagues are in the 90s. And I don't think that's a joke. And what we're talking about is
You mean the Zuckerberg hearings didn't demonstrate extraordinary knowledge of my colleague?
Right. So we're talking about people who are going to buy the next 100 years and farther for 300 million people, possibly 6 billion people. Realistically, more towards 6-7 billion people than 300 million. So I don't think it's an excuse that people don't understand what's going on in the world, why 2016 happened, how networks are affecting things. And I would ask you to take that upon yourself and your colleagues to make sure that people are active. Because if not, problems are going to get worse, and that's going to affect a lot of people. So, and something I'd recommend for anybody who's interested in these issues is a book called The Seventh Sense. It explains a lot of these things. It will give you kind of a much greater perspective on the problems facing us and what we can do to stop them, especially important for people in public policy.
Let me thank you for the comment, and that's, usually when you get one question, it's like that ultimate zinger. So I'm going to take your question and get off the stage and say, but let me make 2 points. One is 100% agree with you. And two, I would, immodestly say that the Intelligence Committee that I'm on, we have, I think, move people up the learning curve. And when we had, and I would say the contrast was as stark as anything. When we had Jack Dorsey and Sheryl Sandberg in recently in the Google empty chair, the level of questioning was relatively sophisticated. That same afternoon, they went over to the House, and people were shrieking about, ideological, preferences, when folks didn't even understand that the algorithms are going to drive you to whichever side of the agenda you lean towards, because it's a money-making venture. So I do think there is hope for moving policymakers up. The other caveat I'd put, and I will say this to maybe some of you guys know, but the social media companies themselves, as well as the best technical people in the U.S. government, at NSA and elsewhere, were almost completely caught flat-footed by what happened in 2016. So I would argue that we all need to up our game. The government needs to up its game. The tech companies need to get out of this haze of, hey, we're just good guys and good gals and, we bear no responsibility. If you have the power they have today, and in a world where chances are their power is only going to exponentially grow, there needs to be a social, moral, and legal set of responsibilities. There needs to be some guardrails. And yes, my job is to both try to help continue to educate my colleagues, but also hopefully not let this issue be bastardized into a Democrat-Republican issue. The only way this can be solved if it stays in a bipartisan kind of future past notion. On that notion, thank you all very much. Thanks for having me. Come over and see me over.